We are with welcome everybody to this afternoon's innovation stream webinar. In the background, you hear some noise, but this is the time and age we live in. Welcome to the next session on by Trust Carbon. We were supposed to have Mark Corbett and Glenn Thorsen in the webinar, but they split their responsibilities. So Glenn is with us, and he will share with you everything that you need to know about Trust Carbon. As you hear, this session is being recorded and available on demand afterwards. We will inform our members when it's ready to look back. If you have any questions, can you drop them in the chat? I will be the voiceover. When I gather some questions, I will ask them to Glenn and he will give a reply. Well, the floor is yours, Glenn. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Odette, and it's great to be here with all of you. Passing on my regrets from Mark, as well. As Odette mentioned, he wasn't able to join us. We had a lot of things going on, so he has a conflict that came up today, but I'm delighted to be able to introduce you all to Trust Carbon and really just do a bit of a run through of what we're working on, some of the innovations that we see and that we're really trying to push from our side as well, and what that means for sustainability and the accessibility of that throughout our industry. So for those of you that aren't familiar with us, Trust Carbon, we are a green technology startup, and everything that we do is focused around a mission where our actions don't have to cost the earth, and really trying to make travel, as we say, effortlessly green. So before we jump into exactly what we do and how and what we see as the emerging innovations in the space, a quick touch as to why this is so important. And for those of you that are already working with sustainability as a focus throughout your business and your travel programs, you'll perhaps have a range of different statistics that you're focusing on or that speak to how you look at sustainability. And we in general don't get into layers and layers and layers of what sustainability means, because it really is different for every organization, for every industry, for every individual as a traveler as well. But one of the statistics that we do like to highlight, because it's just so poignant for all of us in the recent context, when we look at the impact that COVID has had on both the travel industry and all of us at large, air pollution in the same time, so over the course of a year, is responsible for over 3 times as many fatalities when you start to actually take into account causes of death. And this is something which is obviously directly related to climate activity, and something that we can all be a part of a solution towards as we start to really advocate for greener choice. Transport is responsible for around 16% of global emissions, and business travel, of course, sits as a subset percentage within that. So it really is a large element that we can all be a part of. It is something that we can make great decisions around. And as we're going to look into, it's an area that we have fantastic data to support us in making these decisions. And that's really what leads us into this first piece. So from a Trust Carbon perspective, we like to highlight and call out this alternative and the difference between what you can, on the one hand, view as the old approach. It doesn't necessarily even have to be the old approach. In many contexts, it's still the approach that is being taken. It's the approach which is relatively easy to access. And unfortunately, it means we're doing a lot of generalizations when it comes to the reporting side of how we look at emissions. We're reporting with general averages. And of course, that means it becomes relatively inaccurate. And it can also be incredibly expensive if you're taking that out to consultants and they're not really looking at this with a view of applying innovative technologies to do this in a dynamic manner, but really just working with these old average models. And the problem as we start to take that one step further through our travel programs is we can't be very strategic when we're working with generalizations and inaccurate averages. So really when it comes to things like how do we reduce, so if you think of the travel, the emissions hierarchy, reduction being the next step, once you've taken account for your measurements, the only real way to reduce when you're working with averages is to stop or do less. And you can't be strategic around how you do that. And then the final piece on the offsetting side, again, you can only really offset with a generalized number in play. You can't really get involved as to how we're going to apply this across our program and really move the needle on what sustainability means for our business when we're traveling. And that's where, as we call our own approach, the Trust Carbon approach, but really the innovative approach across the industry. When we look at sustainability and travel, there's a whole lot of opportunity out there. Firstly, on the reporting side, as we're going to touch on briefly, it is incredibly incredibly rich data that we work with in travel. So we can do a lot more than calculating on averages. We can work with potentially even live data. We can access insights at the time that we're making decisions, and we can view these throughout the course of how we manage our program. And that then allows us, moving on to the reduction side, to really get strategic with what we're working with here. We can optimize our choices. We can really start to advocate for lower emissions per trip. We're all familiar with the mandate in the travel industry of the lowest logical fare, but the lowest logical emission is also something that is now accessible. It is something that we can start to highlight and say we want to work with that type of information. And then on the removal side, we can obviously do things like aligning with more purposeful travel. The last 18 months have shown us all that it's possible to remove a lot of emissions by doing certain things virtually and certain other things in person, and aligning our travel insights with our policies and our sustainable choices is really an area we can get a lot more strategic here as well. And then there are other emerging technologies, things like direct air capture, more than just offsetting. Sustainable aviation fuel is a big talking point as well. And all of these can come together in a dynamic solution now when it comes to taking the sustainability of your program to the next level. So how do we go about doing that from a Thrust Carbon perspective? Well, we look at ourselves as the carbon intelligence platform. So we sit as this technology layer between you as the travel owner, the travelers themselves, and the providers and partners that you work with in the industry, whether that's booking tools, TMCs, travel management companies, or any range of other solution layers that we can provide that sustainability layer in between the decision making and the actual travel activity. And that's both through our Thrust calculator itself, which is our core underlying technology that does all of the detailed calculations, also provides very detailed post-trip reporting, and then our Thrust Engage side of things, where we're actually looking a lot more at delivering these insights at the time someone is trying to make a booking, at the time that you're making decisions, and linking your policy with all these different data layers in your travel policy. So obviously things like APIs and connections in between these environments really allow for much more dynamic solutions for how you support your travelers with sustainability principles. And the first step on this road really is getting better data. So when it comes to making calculations, we don't work with just averages based on distance buckets, but really taking into account the flight itself. So when you are flying, then we're doing that with the carrier details that are out there. Actual load factors for different carriers mean you have different emissions per trip. So it is possible to look at a trip from London to New York, for example, and see that there are 30 different options with 30 different emissions, not just one average emission for when you're booking that flight, and other details as well. So if you are applying things like carbon budgets to your travel program, making those visible for travelers when they make their decisions, making them accessible when you're planning a trip. And of course, doing this for all different categories of travel. So not just flights, but looking at things like hotel stays, ground transportation, so rail, vehicle rentals as well, and really making sure that all these different pieces are pulling together and you and your travelers are getting the complete picture every step of the way. And we do this with a range of clients and partners in the industry already. So we're well aware, we call ourselves a startup. We've been in the industry for just over 2 years now, but we've had a lot of success and traction in that time. As you can see, we work with some really exciting and innovative travel partners and travel program owners that are really trying to push what does sustainability mean and how do we do this with more strategic insight and not just taking these blunt edge decisions that we may have applied before. And that goes for how we apply and make our research and efforts accessible as well. We do look to make our methodologies as public as possible, as transparent as possible. That goes for access to our APIs as well. So we do have a very collaborative approach when it comes to making all of these things available to ensure that you, as the program owner and your travelers, really have access to the best solutions to make the best decisions when it comes to more sustainable travel. So we're going to look at two aspects of our solution here. So the Thrust calculator, as we talked about, really the whole detail layer that sits under the surface, and the Thrust engage layer as well. So how do we take all of that detailed information and make it more accessible? So it's not just looking at things like post-trip reporting, but dynamic information access as well. And then we're going to finish off just with a brief touch on a few emerging trends that we've seen a lot of uptake on in the last few months in particular, but really, of course, looking into the year ahead. And also just some brief insights as to how accessible they are for you as a program owner. How can you start to apply or think about applying these trends to your travel program and the details that your travelers have available. And as we mentioned, and Adette said as well, please do throw questions in the chat as we go through, and Adette's more than welcome to break in and stop me and pass those questions through so we can answer them as we go, but I will pause a couple of times to make sure we're able to address all of that as well. So the thrust calculator, being our core underlying technology layer, as we've touched on, really is about consuming all of this data that's in the industry that we have access to via both TMCs, reporting layers, expense solutions. There's so much data in the environment of travel, and it does allow us to really get details. So everything that we do when it comes to calculations is built on obviously your existing travel data. We're not going away and doing all these black box exercises and repurposing or re-engineering things behind the scenes. We build all of our calculations on top of established methodologies so that when you receive this data, and potentially you need this internally in the business for your sustainability divisions or any other reporting layers, if you're already committed to net zero targets, if you report to things like the Science Based Targets Initiative, then it's incredibly important that the data you're getting is still reliable and it can still be passed into these other models. So that's why we have the approach of not creating a secret new methodology, but building with the most accuracy that's possible with the data out there on the established methodologies. So when we can apply things like aircraft type, we bring that into the calculations and build increasing accuracy. We do research on all of the different carriers out there to make sure we can apply carrier specific ratios for things like passenger and freight splits and also load factors. And then we apply things like radiative forcing as well, which are, funnily enough, evident in some methodologies, not evident in others. So very often when you start to see big differences in numbers that are calculated, it could be as simple as things like radiative forcing, which is an environmental factor accounting for the impact of an emission taking place at altitude. That's included in certain methodologies like DEFRA, but it's not included in other methodologies like ICAO, the airline industry methodology. So if you see a big difference in some of those numbers, it can really be as simple as that. And for any organizations that are reporting to things like Science Based Targets Initiative, radiative forcing is very often a factor which is required to be part of any numbers that are passed through. So all these different elements play in, but because we have the transparency element around how we calculate, there's always complete access to these insights. And once we've crunched all of those data points through, then it comes back to what are those next steps? How do we visualize this information? How do we bring it back to you, your programs, and your travelers to help understand and start making better decisions and adapting strategies and policies with that information? So of course we have the calculations themselves, the actual tons of emissions that are taking place, and then we start to look at things like equivalencies that can be applied across this, and we break it down into really specific reporting categories that align with how you typically look at travel information and also how you ultimately need this information for it to add value to your program. So equivalencies include things like other metrics of transportation, so we can put it into the context of something that we're familiar with, and activities like video conferencing, which we've all been very familiar with professionally in the last 18 to 24 months, and then nature-based equivalents as well. We have a range of different aspects, and these are contextual as well. So if you're looking at small calculations, perhaps you're looking at an individual. I'm looking at my travel last month, or I'm looking at what was the emission of a team event that we hosted and the amount of 5 people perhaps that got together. So we can view these in different contexts based on the size of the calculation that's taking place as well. So it always has a genuine contextual relevance. And then it comes to the visualization of this. So as we've touched on, we offer comprehensive calculations. It's not just one category of travel. It's really drilling down into all these different aspects. Custom branding on an organizational level is entirely possible and built into our solutions as well. So it can be a part of your strategy when you're leveraging this internally. It's a document that feels and acts like it's yours, and it's part of your program and part of your strategy. And that goes for the analysis layer as well. So we don't just provide you with the raw numbers, what's happening in each category, in each department, but we also start to look into contextual layers like what are the choices of how we travel actually mean. So when we look at things like air to rail comparisons, we're actually doing this based on real analysis of your travel. So we're analyzing all the different flights that you've taken. We have live region support. So for China, North America, and Europe, for example, we actually compare the flight patterns, so the city pairs that you may be flying on, with established rail networks. So if there is a high-speed rail route on a route that you've been actually flying short haul, then we can equate those across and we can start to show you data points saying, well, you actually have, in this context, just over 3,200 flights that were on high-speed rail alternative connections and a volume of 473 tons of emissions that could have been avoided by switching that travel. And that's before we start to get into things like more detailed analysis and perhaps advocating when it's a certain type of trip, you perhaps do a certain type of travel. But this is really just looking at very simple, almost like-for-like trip transitions. to short-haul routes like, for example, London to Amsterdam, where there is a Eurostar network in place, and you can easily transition that to high-speed rail. And some of the other aspects that we provide within the reporting is then other elements of how your travel aligns to things like repeat journey impacts, starting to understand if travelers are visiting the same cities multiple times during a month, for example, what would be the impact of reducing the amount of repeat flights, but then perhaps extending the stay of the trip. So rather than having 3 return flights to the same city during the course of a single month, I would go once and I would stay for 5 days instead of 1 night each time, or I would stay for 4 days. So I'd have a comparable increase in hotel stays, but I would have a drastic decrease in my emissions from return flights. So again, we can start to provide some intelligent analysis layers there, and also aligning to things like actual sustainability goals of the business. If you have carbon targets that are set, if you have a net zero goal and you have timelines for these, we can actually plot those against your travel activity. We can identify your baseline year, and you can start to visualize and model your travel and your emissions against the actual targets that you are committed to working towards. And as we touched on, this is then accessible for all travel categories throughout your program. So analyzing emissions on a flight level, looking at things like different routes, looking at different carriers, really starting to understand how are our emissions spread across our suppliers, across our categories of travel, how are we actually performing when it comes to perhaps flying with more sustainable carriers that are committed to net zero. We have analysis layers to support those insights as well. And then looking at things like hotel stays, and as we talked about, the ground transportation side as well. So rail emissions, split those across country levels. Of course, different countries have different electrified rail networks. They have different standards of just what the emissions are per kilometre when it comes to train travel. They're not all uniform across the board. And understanding those differences are incredibly important when it comes to really optimising and tracking these achievements as well. And as we touched on the methodology side, the transparency here is really important for what we deliver. We believe that transparency on methodology is a really, really key aspect as to how this is going to continue to evolve moving forward. It's very difficult for you as program owners and your travelers to really feel that you're moving forward on sustainability choices if there's not consistency around how the methodologies are applied and leveraged. And that's why obviously understanding and transparency here we feel is so very important. We include complete methodology points like these in all of our reports. So anything that's pushed out, there's always transparency as to how it's generated, what the different aspects mean, and how those calculations are reached. And we're always, of course, happy to answer further questions as well and provide things like raw data to other parts of the business if you need to submit those to other audits or sustainability contributions and data submissions.
Okay, Glenn, I have 2 questions.
Yes.
How can you help employees make the right choice at time of booking?
So I'm actually going to be touching on that in the next section. So
okay.
we'll see a visual response to that as we go.
Okay. And then on the intelligent analysis, what if someone normally would fly in and out in one day and taking the train would mean 1 hotel night? Is that analyzed as well to understand what's the best choice?
So we can certainly support generating calculations around that type of analysis. We don't, as standard, we don't analyze trips that don't happen. So if someone is flying in and out in the same day, there would definitely, especially if you're using something like our thrust engage side, there would absolutely be a recommendation to say you could drastically reduce emissions by either taking train and hotel or even just train, because the emissions of a hotel night would be a tiny percentage of what that return flight would be. So in the vast majority of cases, even if it was to stay the night, for example, of course, then there are other aspects that tie back to policy itself as to travel wellness and that side of things. But from a pure emissions perspective, then those are absolutely some of those cases where, yes, you would see huge opportunity for reducing emissions by transitioning that short haul flight to rail and even potentially a hotel night.
Do you also include in your calculations traveler well-being?
So as a standard point, we don't calculate for traveler well-being. We don't have factors like we do with emission for well-being, but we can certainly support aligning our calculations with other data layers. So we have open APIs, as we've talked about. We do have various partnerships and clients where our data is delivered into other data environments. So it becomes one element of what the policy and program looks at, because obviously as the question touches on, there is still a case of wellness and other aspects. And that's where, of course, sustainability data is one pool of this information. And you, as the program owner, are the only one that can really, at the end of the day, decide what's right for the business. Are we willing to accept a certain, perhaps higher emission degree for something that's better for the traveller, or do we then perhaps have other methods to balance those scales? And that's where we provide our data as freely as possible to make sure that it's possible to make those decisions in uniform.
Okay, thank you. That's for now.
Absolutely. And I think just to finish on that question, absolutely, it's a great question. And I think personally, that's probably going to be one of the bigger challenges for travel managers and program owners in the years to come. It's how to now balance that sustainability angle with the wellness side of things, because in some cases, of course, it is much better for some of us as travelers perhaps to be able to get in and get out again on the same day, be back with family or whatever it may be. But of course, there's also the case for how do we then manage that? And it seems like now the sustainability and well-being side is becoming more important than the cost factor. But of course, it's that triangle now of balance that needs to take place. And that's definitely an area where we're seeing a lot of interest in obviously better data on the sustainability side to help make those decisions. And that's really what this insight is there to support as well from a certain degree. So one of the things that we've seen across a range of our larger clients, when we aggregate a lot of this information to generate some of these insights, if we look across just all of the sort of travel activity in general, by halving the number of repeat city visits, so that example we touched on briefly, visiting the same city once a month instead of twice, and then extending the stay by one night perhaps. So if before you went and stayed for a night, now you stay for 2 nights, and then you can manage both of those client visits in one trip rather than 2, you can reduce emissions by almost a third. So because the flight emissions in the vast majority of cases are just so much higher than a hotel night, there is a lot of opportunity to really optimize and reduce those emissions while still enabling travel and face-to-face meetings. So there is really a big case for starting to analyze this with a more comprehensive view and starting to understand these points. And of course, one of the benefits of that is potentially less trips. So you may have one trip that's a little bit longer, but if you can reduce 1 or 2 other trips, then ultimately you do get less travel out of that. So from a well-being and a family perspective, that certainly touches on that side of things as well. And then to jump back to our other question around how we can support travelers with this information, part of what our APIs are being worked with now from a range of different partners is these accuracy points that we talked about from the thrust calculator perspective, calculating across various carriers, taking into account the aircraft type, the load factors. All of that information is incredibly important to exactly making the greenest decision when it comes to taking your choice points here. And ultimately, if you look at the vast majority of emissions insights that are out there today in most of the corporate booking tools that are available, it tends to be just an average. So when these exercises were done quite a few years back, in some cases, it was a case of saying, we'll take the city pair that's being searched, we'll take the distance between these 2 origin and destination points, and then we'll generate the average emission based on that distance. So when you make a search from London to New York, for example, you'll receive 50 or 100 or however many search results, and they'll all have the same emission. So of course, it's great for building awareness on a low-end perspective, but it's entirely useless for advocating for a greenest choice perspective. It'd be just the same as taking all the costs out of your booking tools and saying, well, you have to choose the lowest fare, but we're just going to give you the average cost when you search for a trip. It's an entirely impossible exercise. So that's part of the things that we're now really working with partners to make available. We're providing our APIs to bring these visuals back, bring these data points back. So when you search on that route from London to New York or whatever it may be, you're seeing the difference between the aircraft being used. You're seeing the optimal results because one carrier may be much better at filling their aircraft, has a higher load factor, and therefore there's a lower emission per passenger because it's more efficient use of the flight time and the fuel being used on that flight. So these information points are all important to come into play. And this is something which we're seeing a lot of traction around. So if you're not already sort of seeing this or expecting or hearing or talking about receiving this from part of your technology solutions in the travel space, then either ask for it or certainly keep an eye open for the months to come, because there's a lot of effort being done across the board here. And we're really expecting to see a lot happening throughout this year on this side of things. And that actually goes for more than flights as well. So some of you may be familiar with HRS and their Green Stay initiative that they've been working very hard on, which is fantastic for starting to generate some insights here. We've essentially done a similar exercise. So hotel data is one of the toughest categories of travel to get real reliable data to help you differentiate on what's a green choice and what is not. Because when it comes to calculating emissions, you don't have access to any of the underlying information. You can't really differentiate the emissions of one hotel to another unless you know what are their waste management principles, who are their energy providers, where do they source their food. There are so many real specific data points you need that you can't expect to get those through a standard booking channel. But what you can get is more transparency and consistency around the sustainability insights that are available. So what we've done on this perspective is we've generated our own hotel sustainability index, and we look into data points such as whether or not the chain is committed to net zero. A chain that's committed to net zero by 2040 is, by the very nature of the efforts, more sustainable than a chain that's not committed to net zero, or a chain that's committed to net zero by 2050 rather than 2040, for example. So by taking some of these standardized, potentially standardized data points into account and building into our solutions layers and making them available through our APIs, they become accessible as well. And it's not just things like, are they or are they not committed to net zero? We also account for any of the sustainability certifications they can get. Because one of the big challenges around those certifications is they're not standard across global regions. I mean, just looking at Europe, for example, the standards that we have in Scandinavia are not the standards, the same standards that we have in Central Europe or that we have in the UK. And then you start to throw in things like the US and all the other regions. And there's just no way for any simple way to look at things and say, well, if it has these badges or not, because they're not consistent across the board. And then there's also the accounting for some of these sustainability standards are self-certified by brands and chains. They say, well, we've got a certain initiative and we've certified that ourselves, whereas others are independently certified by agencies like the GSTC, the Global Sustainable Tourism Council. And they, of course, have a much stronger vetting criteria for how properties can achieve these badges. So by taking all of these points into account and applying them across the board, we've at least tried to make it more consistent and accessible for a program to say, we perhaps want to advocate for a score higher than 65, because we know that that takes into account across the board a range of different pieces, and making these accessible so that they can be used through a range of different booking tools, they can be used in different reporting layers, and we can match those to all of your travel activity, regardless of sort of where the points of activity are actually coming from. So really trying to make this as flexible and accessible as possible so that we can build more transparency and accountability throughout the industry. And that then leads us into the thrust engage side of things. And this is really taking all of these underlying data points that we talk about with the thrust calculator, but bringing them into the program in a more dynamic fashion. So enabling things like emissions dashboards, which allow travelers, teams, anybody throughout the organization to visualize and manage and allocate these emissions and understand what's happening throughout the journey, not just looking at post-trip reporting, of course, but really starting to make sure that any sustainability targets that are in place for the business and therefore are in place for travel can be dynamically allocated and viewed. So we start to look at aspects like how are we performing against perhaps our peers, against similar categories of travelers, how are we performing at making sure we're choosing the more sustainable choices when it comes to hotels, for example, or sticking to the actual principles of when we should be using certain categories of transport for certain distances, or even just providing dynamic recommendations based on the travel activity. So if we can see certain travelers are often bridging against things like business class choices where perhaps they could be using economy class or premium economy. And ultimately, if this is part of the program that's been put in place to optimize the reduced emissions within certain trip purposes. So aligning the reason for travel with the distance and the cabin selection and things like this as well. So we can start to really match with more information than just, for example, cost, or just saying you have to choose a certain cabin class when you travel, but starting to really provide these layers against why we're doing things and when we're doing them. So they become much more dynamic and engaging and accessible for travelers and decision makers throughout the business. And the same thing goes for the budget side of things. When you're applying carbon budgets, which are widely acknowledged by a range of different research and industry professionals and Nobel laureates as well, saying that budgets and sort of tax models, carbon tax in particular, being one of the most efficient manners of reducing emissions. So if that is a real key goal within the organization, how do we enable that in a way that makes sense? Well, ultimately, it needs to be visualized for it to be really effective for travelers. And to that final point about the point of booking and the whole booking journey and experience itself, it needs to be accessible when we're making the decisions. So this is where obviously that layer starts to have a real value in connecting back to the other reporting layers of the business. Making sure that we can visualize the impact of a potential trip at the time of decision, at the time of search, but also visualize the impact against things like a carbon budget. So if I, as a traveler, have a budget for myself or for my team, I'm obviously much more likely to make a better decision if I can see I'm looking at a business class flight that's going to take 30% of our carbon budget for the quarter, whereas I could actually use high-speed rail and that's going to take up 3% of our carbon budget. So if we still need to travel and we still need to manage these different selection categories, we're able to do that with better information at a time that it can help us to make that better decision. So the benefits through the Thrust Engage side of things really is about making sure that we're empowering stakeholders with access to the right data at the right time, and empowering the decision makers and program owners to visualize this data and to help the travelers be a part of that strategy, and really make sure that the commitment aligns with the accessibility of what we're doing here. And then the final piece that we talked about wanting to share as well is some of these trends that we see from an industry perspective. A couple of them we have obviously referenced throughout the session itself, but the first one, as you can see, more detailed emissions information being available during that booking experience. This is something which it is already happening in various contexts, and you may already have pushed for this. You may already be working on projects or initiatives where you're working for this to become a reality. If you're not, it's definitely something that is entirely reasonable to ask for. And it's definitely something that I would say you expect to see things in the coming months for sure, because there's a lot of effort going on in a lot of different categories to really help make this information accessible, because it's what people are asking for. It's what travelers want to make better decisions. And it is entirely possible. It's not something which is incredibly difficult given the nature of our industry. The information, the data is already there. It's just a case of really prioritizing to make it available. And that leads nicely into the second piece, carbon budgets on a broader scale. There's been a lot of talk in the last 12, even 24 months about carbon budgets. In many cases, they're still talked about as incredibly innovative. Ultimately, they're not as innovative perhaps as they're being talked about being, and they certainly shouldn't be, because it's very similar to what we've already been doing in the industry. We have travel budgets, we allocate those on a departmental and perhaps team base or other elements. So it's entirely feasible to allocate carbon budgets as well. Of course, the real stopping point there has been better and more accurate data to make them more accessible. And that's obviously part of now, with the more detailed emissions insights emerging, those carbon budgets become a lot more accessible as well. And for those of you where your organization has perhaps already committed to net zero or even actual emissions reduction milestones, those carbon budgets can become an incredibly important aspect of how you support the business in getting there. And also, at the end of the day, how you track and visualize that all the hard efforts you are making in travel are actually delivering. Because if you're not tracking a lot of those emissions reductions, then it becomes very difficult to actually support and showcase how you've been delivering against those elements. And the final piece is that increased focus on other categories. So we're looking now not just at flights when it comes to emissions in travel. We are looking at all the different categories. We are looking at sustainability across the entire spectrum of what we do from a travel perspective. And the data points are very much there. It is possible to get insights on all those different elements. So it's definitely something that can be an increasing focus of how we look at what does sustainability mean for our travel category. So with that, I will hand it back to you, Odette, if there's any sort of closing questions, or perhaps even any areas you want to just double back on a little bit and dig into a little further.
I have 2 more questions, and perhaps 3. The question is here: which OBTs do you work with these days?
So on the OBT side, I'm not able to share any sort of publicly right now. We are working with a few different partners, and there are some scheduled press releases due to go out probably during the next 2 or 3 months. So there will be some announcements that make at least some of those partnerships very obvious. That's about as much as I can share, unfortunately.
Okay, but anyone that works with APIs are welcome to join to work together, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And we work together with companies like Booking.com. What about companies that offer meeting tools?
So we do have a few different partnerships with companies that offer meeting solutions. So Troop Travel in the industry, one of the companies that we already work very closely with. And again, if there is an open to data connection API perspective, we're very open to collaborating with any range of solutions partners when it comes to a travel program's requirements in that regard. For some of our corporate clients, we connect into other data layers like PredictX, for example, in the industry as well. So we are very flexible there when it comes to making sure we get the best value for the requirements.
Okay, this is my contribution to the session. There are no more questions. So Pascal, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Odette. And if anyone has any questions remaining, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll give it a few more seconds. For now, first of all, Glenn, thank you very much for your presentation this afternoon and for your partnership. It's highly appreciated. And I don't see any other questions coming in, so we'll be able to give some time back to everyone. So on behalf of BATM and NATM, I want to thank everybody who joined us today. Just note that next week on the 17th, we have another webinar coming up, and there will be more announcements shortly on additional webinars. Look at our LinkedIn page or keep an eye on your email box for more information. Thank you very much for everybody today for joining. Wish you a great rest of the day and talk soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, everybody.